We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 227 for December 1st, 2021. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about mandatory vaccinations and paid sick leave. So roll up your sleeves because you're about to get stuck and because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Bill.
Hello.
Andrew.
Hey, everybody.
And Heather.
Hi, everyone.
And for the first time in like 10 years, I didn't say where they were from because they're all in California. Woo-hoo. So it's kind of we used to be all spread out across the United States, but you guys are all in California. So at least I'm on the other side. I'm in North Carolina right now.
Balance this out a little bit.
Yep. So anyway, we are, as we mentioned in the intro, talking about, as we're coming into winter here in the latter part of 2021. If you're listening to this in real time, we're coming obviously into cold and flu season. Fortunately for a lot of archaeologists that work in at least this country and many northern latitudes, you're indoors for a lot of this season, either not working at all or working on lab stuff or reports, depending on what you do. There are, of course, areas in this country that work all year round. Heather's in one of those, Southern California. I've worked in Florida in the winter. We've worked, there's lots of places where you can still work in the winter time, especially places where you can dig. It might be rock hard clay that's frozen, but I've done it. I know a lot of people have done it. But for a lot of people, this is kind of an off season, and we want to talk about, cold and flu and some labor laws. But before we get to that, as my wife and I got our COVID booster shots yesterday, and I've got family members that are refusing vaccinations that are state mandated because they have jobs that require that. I'm curious from the panel here what we think about that, just from a working standpoint. And Bill isn't going to be with us for the last two segments, so I want to get his thoughts on that. Bill, what are your thoughts on requiring vaccinations for students? Obviously you're a professor, and professors alike. I don't know what the mandate there is. Yeah. But what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, also I wasn't super prepared for this episode, so I'm trying to find our requirements from the university campus. But essentially, the state of California has kind of stayed before the crest, stayed at the forefront of this whole thing. For example, the state of California, had these lockdowns and all this other, we call them lockdowns, but in all fairness, it was kind of like, you can't go to the bar and there's no concerts, but in general, most of our lives still just kept moving because, of course, folks didn't 100% follow all the rules, right? So stuff like Christmas and Thanksgiving went off with no hitch. People just still went and saw their families and they just rolled the dice, right? So that happened. And also, you could always go to the grocery store. You can always go outside and, hike and do whatever else. You just can't play like baseball and everybody can't be in the stadium. So a big chunk of our society still kept functioning. That's why I think it's crazy when you see what's going on in Europe right now, where they're launching another round of lockdowns and there's riots in several different countries over, the fourth or fifth round of lockdown. But like in California, it was at the kind of front edge of that. And so as such, So the rule that the University of California system put out was that, you know, they encouraged everyone to get vaccinated, but it wasn't mandatory. So that's one key thing. Anybody listening out there, no state government has like forced any of its state employees to get vaccinated. You had the ability to have a waiver if you had, you know, like a medical issue that you shouldn't get vaccinated, or even something like pregnancy, which isn't a medical issue, but like we don't really know what will happen if you get the vaccine. It's not clear. So, you know, if you're going to have a baby, no one was forcing them to get the vaccine before that was before it was approved to have for pregnant women. Also, you can get a religious waiver too. So you just need to fill out what you're supposed to. If it's against your beliefs to have that, then, you know, that's definitely acceptable. So I'm trying to find the rules because they change like every single other day. And a lot of times it's like nuanced changes. But one of the things I was able to figure out really quickly, because they asked all faculty, all staff, and all students to get vaccinated on campus at UC Berkeley, University Campus Health shows that undergrads and grads are over 98.9%, or 98%. Undergrads are 98.3% fully vaccinated, or graduates 98.8% fully vaccinated, and faculty and staff are 91% vaccinated, which leads the state of California in vaccination. And kind of as a result, well, I mean, it doesn't lead the entire state, but that's way higher than the actual state of California's vaccination rate. And as a result, the campus is detecting, 1 or 2 cases a day, positive cases a day. So, and that's out of thousands of tests given each week. So, I got my vaccination. My kids, they're in their elementary and middle school. They got their first round. So obviously, I believe in vaccinations. I've always gotten my vaccination for, tetanus and all the other illnesses because we work in the field, right? I didn't always get a flu shot until I spent 2 years without getting sick. Then I started getting, I got the flu shot. And so the other thing that really helps is that in the case of COVID, it's free, right? So you can go and get your vaccination for free. In the case of your other shots, a lot of time, you got to have health insurance, which a lot of people who are doing archaeology, they don't have any health insurance, or their health insurance isn't good. And so it may not cover like their basic round of immunizations. So you're kind of talking to someone who's, I guess I believe in the science before there was even, it didn't seem like it was that complicated to me, that if it's like an airborne infectious disease, as someone who has asthma, as someone who's dug in sites that have like hantavirus and stuff and knows about wearing masks and protect yourself when you're around potentially hazardous, sediments or anything, right? Like I'm already used to the fact that like if it could possibly kill me or give me cancer way down the road, and I know about that, then I'm going to try to protect myself, whether that's wearing a mask or wearing a Tyvek suit or washing my hands, whatever, out in the field. I always was that person. And so this is like no different from me, but I can't tell other people what to do. And the other thing is everybody is along a spectrum of, willingness to basically be a citizen, right? The same science that brings you the internet that you use to rip on the government and stuff like that follows the same laws of, discovery, right? In this country, we have a long tradition of scientific discovery and, focusing on medicine and science. And it's not all just a Wall Street ripoff, right? I mean, they're doing all their stuff there, but they're making inventions. And sometimes those things make our lives a little bit better. So it's kind of crazy that people will pick and choose like, what bit of science they feel like they need to believe in, even though the device they're using, they don't understand, because it's like, 70 years of technological development that brings you that phone that on the bathroom you can use and say, you're never going to believe, you don't believe in no science, right? It's solid science that you're living, sitting on that toilet. That's science development. The electric lights that light that thing up so that you can see your thing. That's all science. Your phone, all of it's science, right? And then you would just pick and choose like, well, I don't believe in any of that stuff. So to me, it just seems like it's kind of like crazy. And for someone who's supposed to be a scientist, like an archaeologist, it's like a double dose. So I have not surveyed folks outside of academia about their vaccination situation. Frankly, it's none of my business really. But if the stuff works, then I have very little to fear. I'm less likely to get hospitalized and crippled from COVID because I've gotten the medicine than someone who hasn't. And that's kind of like, at the end of the day, that's all that matters to me, right? Like they're trying to shut all the stuff down. They're trying to force people to do stuff. To me, a year, 2 years in, and you have medicine available and you're not going to get it. Like that's like the person who just eats horrible food and never exercises for their whole life. Like, am I really supposed to like find a way to accommodate them for their horror story choices that they've made their entire life? I mean, I guess so. If you ask the Dalai Lama, yeah, I should. But in reality, that's not how my world works, or most of our world. That's not the way we work.
Yeah. Heather.
There's one thing I think we need to remember is, first of all, I think Berkeley's always the percentages as vaccination, and overall universities' percentages are always going to be higher than the state because of the fact that these universities are requiring vaccination or you can't be there, or you have a waiver. But waivers are not as easy as they appear. It's not, you can't, if you just have a belief that you don't want to get vaccinated, that's not covered by medical, it's not covered by religious beliefs, you still have to get it, or you can't go to university. So, I think it's interesting the universities are taking credit, almost as if they've gotten all these people vaccinated that wouldn't have otherwise gotten vaccinated. I do think that that's true. I think there's a lot of students that probably wouldn't have gotten vaccinated just because they're students and they don't get vaccinated for other things as they have other things on their mind that's not important to them. They're invincible, right? But the concept that universities are now 98, 99% vaccinated. Well, that's because you've removed out of that population that could be calculated into the percentage those that refuse to vaccinate. Therefore, they're not going to the university anymore. So, I think it's interesting when, we see these percentages and politicians want to push that because they feel that, they've accomplished a lot, when in actuality, you've just removed people out of the calculation of percentages. So, I think, first of all, that was just one of my points there. I think as far as what we're seeing in the workforce for archaeology, for CRM, there's a lot of people that are not vaccinated and don't want to be vaccinated, specifically the as needed population. There's a lot of them that do not want to be vaccinated. And we're struggling with that as the company that I work for. We are a federal contractor. So we are, it doesn't matter OSHA or not, or whether or not that, the OSHA fight is going to be successful. It doesn't matter for us because as federal contractors, we're going to be required. Now, that date has been pushed back. It was December 4th. Then it was like January 8th or something. Now it's been pushed back again to January 18th. And so it just keeps, that federal mandate keeps getting pushed back as far as when they're going to require it. So that when you do that, now you're giving people this idea that actually might not happen. Who knows? The federal mandate might be, they may pull back on that and not require it at all. It seems odd that it keeps getting pushed back. So it's giving people that false sense. Well, it may not be a false sense. It gives them the sense that maybe eventually, if they wait it out long enough, they won't need to get vaccinated. So young people, I think if you put something in front of them and they can't have what they want, or they get back, unless they get vaccinated, they're going to get vaccinated.
The interesting thing here is, especially talking about college students, right? Which in archaeology, California is kind of one of the exceptions sometimes with some of the older field techs that never did go to college or got some completely different degree. There's still quite a few of those people in California, but in general, if you're working in CRM, you went to college. And I remember having to show proof of vaccinations when I went to college, just like your standard vaccinations that you really should get as a child. Yep. I had to show proof of that. And in some cases, I don't think I had proof, so I just had to get them. It's like, it was too long ago. I don't know where this is. Right. Yeah, my parents are disorganized. Like where is this? Right.
I remember when I went to Arizona, I got like 4 vaccination shots in about 20 seconds. They just lined them all up on a tray and it was because they didn't have the last record of my vaccination from when I was like 12 years old. So they just were like, boom, boom, boom. If you don't have a religious, this was Arizona too.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I don't, also, especially for, say, archaeology minded people, if you've gone to a field school outside of this country, then more than likely you had to, if you didn't already, get some other shots or vaccinations or something to go to the country that you went, which is also required. And I don't think there necessarily even are religious exemptions for some of that stuff. Like, it's just like you either get it or you're not coming into our country. Yeah, and that's absolute.
That's the deal with that stuff. Like for the working in Belize, you get your vaccinations. Like nobody ever in the history of working there, I've worked there for the better part of 30 years. I've never heard someone go, well, I would go, but hepatitis B vaccination isn't going into my body.
Yeah, no joke. I know. And there's always this stuff about well, the vaccine came out too new, and I'm just shaking my head like, you just took AirPods and all this other stuff, right. They just built a 5G tower on top of your building, and that came out pretty fast. And I don't want to fearmonger or anything like that, but I'm just shaking my head that there are many precedences where lane assist on a car, people are using their Teslas, not even using their hands. It's not like that stuff has been in the works for 40 years like vaccines have. And so you're going to trust your whole life driving down the freeway to your car to drive its own self, and
I don't think you're fear mongering. It's like we're taking a moment to go, wow, isn't technology amazing sometimes? We made a vaccine against a deadly disease in like a year. That's impressive.
Yeah. And we don't try to talk about politics too much on this show, but it's crazy how in this country, especially, vaccination became more of a political issue, because the vaccination, not vaccination, does tend to go down party lines a little bit. Not exclusively. There are some people that are just, I don't know, being overly cautious for whatever reason, but just in my own anecdotal experience, it's been that way, and it's really strange.
Well, I think, as far as, people of color, there's also a huge distrust of just medicine in general because of the legacy of all kinds of stuff that's happened over years and years and years.
Sure.
So I can see how that would be, probably an insurmountable thing to convince a lot of people of color whose people have been experimented on and have never had access to actual healthcare where you preemptively go in and get well checks and stuff rather than waiting till cancer is eating your whole body and then you actually go and do something about it. So like there's a long tradition of people being experimented upon mixed with like neglect, lack of being around doctors or listening to doctors' opinions.
I also think that we need to, I understand that sentiment. I mean, it's very common that it is somewhat, there is a correlation between political leanings and the vaccination beliefs. However, really look at the fact that archaeologists on a whole, I mean, I think we could say very, very much lean a certain political direction, right? And you have a lot of archaeologists that do not want to get vaccinated. So I think it is a misconception that the vaccination, I mean, maybe the loudest people against vaccinations are leaning in a certain direction, but I think there's a lot of people that are silent in their questioning of this vaccination and other vaccinations and don't want it. And there's a lot of people that are just that believe in a natural way of letting their body heal. And I think that, we can't conflate the religious or political beliefs with this stance on vaccination. I am not disagreeing with anything that anybody else has said so far in this. I just think that we need to respect the fact that there are people that do want to live their life in a natural way. Now, there are certain, I think like tetanus, there's certain things that your body, if you're not vaccinated for it, you're going to have to, obviously you're going to have to get that vaccination in order to combat that. But there are some, like the flu. A lot of people don't get the flu vaccination because they want it to run its course in their body. And so, obviously the flu, the COVID and COVID are two different separate things. But I just think we need to be careful because if you just look at our discipline, it actually doesn't pan out that way. I don't think necessarily it does go along political lines.
Sure. Yeah. And that makes sense for archaeology. We've always been a little bit different. And on that note, let's take a break and we're going to continue talking about some of this stuff on the other side. Back in a minute. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Welcome back to episode 227 of the CRM Archaeology podcast. And of course, we're talking about vaccinations and all kinds of stuff. And we had a pretty good discussion over the break because Bill had to take off, so he won't be joining us for the last two segments of the episode. But some things came up, and Heather, I wanted to comment on something you were saying at the end about people's choices to let their body heal naturally and things like that. And I am all for somebody doing whatever they want to do naturally, right? Like if you've got cancer and you'd rather go to a homeopathist and rather than get chemotherapy, that's your choice, right? It doesn't impact me other than I'll be sad when you're gone, right? That would suck. Right. But if you choose to not get a vaccination against a deadly disease that could possibly prevent you from giving it to me, and then me giving it to somebody who is maybe compromised or something like that. I mean, I just had a good friend in Civil Air Patrol pass away this week, and I found out he was unvaccinated. Now he was like 70 something and not like in the best health, but he's a pilot, advanced. He was one of the few FAA master flight instructors, just a really great guy, brought a lot of people into aviation, into our squadron as well, and refused to get vaccinated, and then ended up in the hospital and was dead 3 days later on the ventilator the whole time. So it's a choice that impacts others when you're doing that. And I think choices that impact others, it's along the same lines of, as I mentioned in the break, you're not allowed to smoke in the work vehicle. You're not allowed to smoke in the office. You're not allowed to drink in the work vehicle. Why would you be allowed to bring a life-threatening disease into the vehicle that could potentially impact others? It doesn't make any sense. And if you're making that personal decision, then you need to make the personal decision to work somewhere else, as far as I'm concerned. So,
well, I think, so I'm going to play the devil's advocate on the last statement there. So yeah. When it comes to, smoking, drinking, these are decisions that you're making in the moment, in the instant. Not smoking, that's an instant, it does impact the person that you're with, obviously. As far as COVID, first of all, by somebody not being vaccinated does not mean they're automatically carrying COVID and that they automatically have COVID. So, that's true. This is a risk that you're taking, whether or not that person could have COVID. The other, and these are all arguments that people have made, but I think they're fair. And I think that we're not going to understand. I mean, I'm talking about a general we, not you and me. Mm-hmm. We're not going to understand each other if we're not willing to at least look at some of these points. And one of the points is that if somebody is vaccinated and somebody is not vaccinated, why is the person who is vaccinated concerned? Because they are vaccinated, right? They're vaccinated so they don't catch it. The person who decides not to be vaccinated, who isn't necessarily carrying COVID, if they do end up with COVID, the reason the person who's vaccinated is vaccinated is to protect themselves. So, these are they're fair points. And I think a lot of times in this country, we're just, saying, okay, we're not even going to entertain that concept, right? But that's a very logical question, a very logical point. And so, I think it's a fair one to bring up. The other is, as far as, the vaccination right now, unfortunately, we're seeing more and more people that are catching COVID, even though they're vaccinated. So, that kind of blows that argument.
Well, no.
Or at least it doesn't blow it out, but it definitely impacts it.
Look, I don't think those points are actually fair at all. It's like if you don't get vaccinated, you're a drag on the community and the society. You are not doing, like, how un-American, how anti-community is it? You won't get a vaccination. You won't have a stick into your arm for 2 seconds in order to protect children and pregnant women and people with pre-existing conditions. It's like, you can't do that for society. How weak are you? I'm tired of those what about my feelings? I don't give a damn.
But what about people that are legitimately are medically unable to do the vaccination?
For them. They're the 0.5% that the rest of us are protecting. I'm happy if you have a real condition, that's fine. But if you don't, it's not fine.
That's a very small number of people, right? And they should be protected against that. Absolutely.
I understand, but it's still, these are, Andrew, I'm not arguing with you at all. I'm just saying that we need to have at least, we can't just, it's like when you're a kid, right? your parents, the parents have a right to say no, yes, no, and they don't have to give you an answer. But the kid's not going to understand unless there's some kind of back and forth, some logical discussion. And so to just say that some of these points don't have any merit, and I don't think that's what the purpose of this podcast is, but that they don't have any merit just because you're not being American or you're not, and whether it doesn't, whether I agree with you or I don't agree with you,
right?
It's still something that, in order to persuade or to have a productive conversation where maybe you might be able to persuade somebody, to just tell somebody they're un-American or they're being very irresponsible or they're being unkind or they don't care about their fellow American is not going to persuade people.
I know what you mean. I know where you're going, and I understand the persuasion concept. And if I was maybe in a different venue or something, or trying to persuade somebody, I get the you catch more people with honey kind of thing. Absolutely. But I feel like just here in the moment, I can kind of be myself, and I'm like, look, I'm tired of how in America we make everything some sort of funky 50-50 give and take. Like everything's a 50-50 give and take. In this case, it's not. It's 100-0. Like the anti-vaxxer side is ludicrous. That's all. That's just the fact. And again, yes, if I'm trying to get someone vaccinated, I'm going to be like, hey man, it's like a good idea to kind of do this. Hey, get on board, but just here being myself, I'm like, oh, please be an adult, take responsibility.
Yeah, and I could be wrong here. I'm definitely not a medical professional, but I'm under the understanding that vaccination doesn't necessarily prevent you from getting COVID. It mitigates the effects of COVID if you do get it, right, or coronavirus. So it just makes it so you're more likely to survive it. But you can still get it if you're vaccinated, and you can still pass it on to somebody else if you're vaccinated, right? It doesn't prevent you from getting it.
That was in the beginning. It was to prevent. For a long, long time, it was to prevent. That was the mantra.
We thought it would.
And obviously, we know now it doesn't. And just so that people know where not where I sit, but where my background is, and I think Chris and Andrew probably know this. My father was in the hospital in June of 2020, and he ended up in the hospital for 4 months because of COVID. He is 80 years old. He did survive. He survived because he had a family that was fighting tooth and nail, would not take him off of basically the ventilator. And he did survive. He did eventually come out. He was in a coma. I mean, it was scary. It was awful. It was awful. Yeah. And so I get it. Like I've been there. I've lived through it. I sat by my father's side for a month and fighting with the doctors, them telling me that, he's lived a good life. He's overweight, he's got asthma, all this kind of stuff. Let him go. Basically is what they were saying. Yeah. And we did not let that happen. And he survived. Now,
that's good.
I'm not saying that people that didn't survive didn't have family that were fighting for them. I'm sure they did. But it's, just so you know, that is where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. I've had very intimate personal experience with this. So, but I think that, we do need in this country to have just a little bit more. I know it's an emotional topic. Trust me, it's emotional for me. But when we get into the emotional, and I also understand what Andrew's saying, because we're in a soundbite here. He's a little bit more succinct than I am. I tend to go on and on. But, we do need to have some more logical conversations, because we are seeing this is impacting us separate from the medical issue. This is impacting us and our ability to put people out, put people to work. People are losing their jobs. People are giving up on their jobs. I mean, this is serious stuff. And it's not just this, easy, if you're not going to get it, you're out of luck. I mean, it's going to impact us, even those that are vaccinated, is going to impact them if jobs, or if people start losing companies, if we're not able to get contracts, if you're working for a company exclusively that can't get a federal contract, because I mean, it's just, it's a bigger thing than just the medical issue. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, it's a conversation that needs to be had. If somebody, and it doesn't need to be, I mean, obviously we have our opinions here and we're just voicing those opinions. But if I had somebody working for me that said, yeah, I refuse to get vaccinated for whatever reason, right? Then I'd be like, okay, that's your choice. I'll give you a great reference, and I hope you find something that works for you. Yeah. I mean, that's just the way it is, right? I'm not saying that we need to be violent with them or berate them for their opinions, but you're not going to work here,
right?
And that's your personal choice. Decisions. Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, your personal choices have consequences. So go find a place to work where they don't care about that. Yeah. But.
And I am curious too. I mean, we have a lot of like hanger-ons who don't want to get vaccinated or whatever. But if the whip really comes down and it's like, hey, you have to get vaccinated for all these jobs, because people are worried like, oh, there won't be enough people to do these certain jobs. Yeah, I think a decent amount of them will get vaccinated when it's like, look, you have to, or guess what? You don't have any medical insurance for your family. So do it. I think those numbers will change.
Yeah. In archaeology, we have a larger than many professions. We have an as needed population, right? We don't right. So there's also people are already the retention for as needed archaeologists is already very low, just because the conditions are not great, and it's difficult it's difficult to be an archaeologist for a long period of time. It wears hard on your body, and so. That coupled with this decision and where people stand on whether or not they want to get vaccinated is absolutely going to impact the as needed force. It's already impacting it. And so, it's just a real conversation. It's also going to lead to other decisions that, the things that you see on social media threads as far as people that work in, as needed contractors who aren't necessarily archaeologists that are being, that companies are going to start having to go that way. They're going to have to start hiring people that aren't necessarily archaeologists to dig, because otherwise we're just not going to have the people. So, but that's a whole other podcast.
We'll work something out. And again, my students who are all vaccinated will work as scabs in order to cover all local companies, and will make it to the prosperous land. You know what I mean? Right. So and again, as I joke, I'm also like, hey, look, there's other possibilities. Like if somebody's just holding it over your head, like, well, I won't get vaccinated, or, if you make me, well, I'll just quit. It's like, all right, see you later.
Well, there's laws though that you can't, companies also are right now they're treading this fine line. They're just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen, because they also don't want the repercussion of firing somebody and then end up having wrongful termination. So you have to be really careful.
No, of course, and that is a ever-changing goalpost, that kind of stuff. Yes. I mean, I noticed that even at the community college level, just that stuff is always back and forth. So that is, I understand that is a difficult.
Yeah.
This is just making me think what Bill was saying in the first segment about people picking and choose the technology and things like that they choose to lose their minds over. And I have seen people lose their minds over a company not providing water, right? Or if they don't have a water jug that day. And yet, if they tell you to get vaccinated, now you're going to lose your mind over that. But the company is not providing you water. You can't provide yourself water, apparently. But if the company doesn't provide you water, you're going to lose your mind on that company because they are being unsafe. But they go require you to wear seatbelts or be vaccinated, and all of a sudden that's where you draw the line. So, I don't understand it. So let's lead this into 3/4 of the way through this podcast, our topic, which is coming into cold and flu season. Obviously, people are going to be more susceptible to a lot of things as the weather cools down. People are outside doing things where you're just more prone to catch stuff like that. I think things like COVID, as we saw in 2020, will actually decrease over the winter like they do because it's transmitted through human contact, and you're being around other humans. And if you're around other humans less because you're indoors, then you're less likely to catch it. Same thing with cold and flu season. That being said, one of the things Doug actually came up for the topic for this, but couldn't make the show. So he left us some notes talking about paid leave for sick leave, basically, and what's required. And he said in the research he's done is there's no real federal law in the U.S. that requires paid leave, not for non-federal employees, for like regular companies, right? There's no real federal regulation around that, but some states, counties, and cities in the U.S. do have laws mandating paid sick leave. So I'm kind of like, talking about Heather's example of on-call employees and, shovel bums, if you will, and around the country. That's not even a conversation they want to hear. They're probably tuning out the podcast right now because they're like, I never have and never will get paid sick leave because I'm an on-call employee, But that being said, sometimes a lot of companies hire you full time just at a different status. Even if you're only there for 3 or 4 weeks, because we're often not allowed to hire contractors, right? So you'll be hired on full time, but does that warrant giving you, paid sick leave or anything like that? I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts on this? And really, we'll just give one little thought on this, maybe Andrew, right? Because we're almost done.
I'll just do like a quick one. Again, in my experience in CRM, some idea like paid leave was 1,000 miles away. Right. I don't even think it registered ever on my personal Richter scale. I just thought that, well, if I don't show up, then there's no money that day. I don't think I ever even heard of it in any contract I signed ever.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And I'm a huge idiot. I'm basically full time with a massive company that's outside of CRM right now, but I chose to keep my contractor status. It's a whole weird thing. The company I was working for was purchased by this bigger company. Most of the people here went full time with the bigger company. We were all contractors with the other company. And I maintained my contractor status just because I see benefits in that. So while they're all talking about holidays and, are you working on, these days and those days, I'm like, I'm working pretty much every day because partly because I choose to, but also, I also have the freedom to say I'm not working today because I am a contractor. Right. So, it's not paid, but I also have the ability to just say I'm not going to do it. Anyway, let's talk about this a little more. I'm interested to get Heather's perspective on this as somebody working for a big company in California, and we'll do that in our last segment on the other side of the break. Back in a minute. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to ArchPodNet.com/shop for a link. That's ArchPodNet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is episode 227 of the CRM Arc podcast. Again, Bill is not here because he's on paid sick leave from the Archaeology Podcast Network. It's actually not true because we provide zero benefits.
And zero pay.
And zero pay on top of it. So it still kind of equals out. But that's what we're talking about right now. And Heather, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Of course, we're not mentioning the company you work for and all that stuff, keeping it generic, but I mean, maybe we can just talk about policies that you've seen, maybe that you're doing now, but definitely that you've seen around paid sick leave. Like when are you eligible for that kind of thing?
Well, in California, you're eligible. You accrue sick leave on the first day of your employment.
Regardless of your status, like what type of employee you are? Okay.
Yeah. And so that started in July 2015. And it's, I guess, 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. So, So if you work for just like a 2-month project for you guys or a 4-week project, do you get paid out that sick leave or do you lose it? No, you don't get paid out sick leave. My understanding is you don't get paid sick leave. Sick leave is there if you use it. If you need it. Right. Okay. So I am never sick. Even if I'm sick, I can't afford not to be working on my projects because then just, as everybody knows, and that's a manager in CRM or otherwise. And so exactly. I never use my sick time and I lose it at the end of the year. I accrue sick time and I lose it. So now that's different than vacation time, but sick time, you will lose it. I know that California has one of the most beneficial or generous sick hours that, than any other state. So I think that may be unique. I don't know a whole lot about the other states, but in California, you're going to accrue sick leave on your first day, and it's 1 hour for every 30 hours worked.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely worked for companies that had very similar policies, right? Whether they were mandated to or not, I wasn't really sure. But I will say, just for new people out in the field, talk to the crew chief out there. If you're out on, say, if you work in the West, generally you're working like a 10 on 4 off situation a lot of times, not every time, but sometimes you're working 10 on 4 off. I've worked 8 on 6 off. I've worked 9 on 5 off. That was weird. But it's typically you're out there full time with people. You're in a hotel, something like that. Talk to whoever the senior person is in the field for that company. And if you don't feel great in the morning, sometimes that kind of stuff just gets pushed under the rug, to be honest. Yeah. And it's like, hey, it's one day. Now, if you show up and you're visibly hungover, like you're going to pay for that as far as I'm concerned. But if you wake up and you're just under the weather and you'd rather just stay in for the day, or maybe if you have the ability to stay in for half a day or something, just kind of talk to them. And it doesn't have to be like an official policy sometimes. Now, of course, not every company is like that, but just get the understanding from the people in the field.
You have to be a little careful, especially if you have a larger company. I mean, first of all, if you're in California, it is what it is. I mean, you get it.
Yeah.
Right. Now, you may end up not having much. Maybe you just started for the company. You only have an hour, sure. But you have something.
It's better than 0 hours.
Exactly. So, I think that you can go to the crew chief and see, and then they'll usually just, forward you on to HR, because that's not something a crew chief or a manager can make a decision on, or shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. Especially in larger companies, the idea of equity is really important as far as making sure that, what they give one person, they give everybody. And so having special dispensation or special arrangements is difficult, because then there goes your equity, right? Either you do it across the board or you don't do it at all. So, but HR, they want to keep people. And so, sometimes I think, like, especially with as needed, people are really fearful of talking to HR. HR is your friend. Actually, HR exists because they're there to make sure, that the employee is treated properly and that all the laws are followed.
I think one of the problems, though, that comes in is, and this really is on field techs, and I'm glad we're talking about this. So if you're a field tech working for a company right now, you really do need to find out what those contacts are. Yeah. I've worked for plenty of decent sized companies where I never met anyone from the office, not even the PI, right? You show up on the site for the first day of the project in the field, at the hotel, wherever the meeting point is, and you leave from there not having ever seen anyone that works in the office, not ever even met anyone in HR. You hand your employment paperwork to the crew chief or the project director, or you emailed it in, one way or the other, and you never have any interaction with those types of people, and you don't know who those contacts are. Now, It's not that they don't want you to have that information. It's that CRM crew chiefs, project managers, even PIs are inherently kind of poor managers, because we're never really given management training. So they don't really know to give that information. But if you ask for it, give it
to you. Well, some of the tricks are now, if you're working for a larger company, the HR is always going to have something on the website, because HR should be able to be contacted separate from anybody that's managing you. That's set up so that you have anonymity from complaints, so that somebody that is managing you can't hold something against you, right? And so
reciprocity.
Right. So you can talk to HR without that issue. So that's one thing. If you're not sure and you have some issue, whether sick leave or otherwise, always look on the website. There is almost always a HR contact that they are really by law not allowed to disclose what it is that you're saying to them.
Mm-hmm. Right. So. I think that so many people don't make that call. I'm just speaking from my own experience. Like, I never did it. And I'm just here to tell everyone, don't be me, definitely make that call. I'm serious. It's like Heather said, look on the website and then cold call them and just talk about some of these issues, because you want to know this. And you're acting in good faith. You're not doing anything nefarious or secretive. You're just like, hey, I'm just curious about, maybe you're curious about your benefits. Maybe you're curious about, like we're talking about sick leave or whatever. I never did that. And I really wish I did. And so just for everyone out there, just make that cold call, just make that contact. You'll learn actually probably more about stuff you didn't think of, like benefits or something that you weren't thinking of before.
I'll take it even one step further. When you ask questions like that, it shows that you are a little more business minded, that you're more mature of an employee, that you're not just there to just make the 8 hours and that's it. You really are thinking through things critically. And when I have somebody, I interview them, we hire them, they ask questions like that in a respectful manner, not like, the big company, you better not be screwing me over, here's my questions type of attitude.
What can I get out of this?
Exactly. Yeah. But if you're coming with the right attitude, you're asking those questions, you know what, that makes my ears perk up. That makes me think, this person is a critical thinker. This person is a little bit more savvy, a little more professionally minded. It's a good thing. It's not, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. So never be afraid. As long as your heart and your motivation are in the right place, good to ask those questions.
Absolutely. I always say, act in good faith. You'll hear me say that, 1,000 times, but just having this conversation, I'm like, man, I got to tell my students, like several of whom are working in CRM right now. I'm like, dude, get in contact with your HR, learn this stuff. Yeah. It looks good.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I think, the other thing is that just remember also when you're feeling ill, you're feeling, sick. Obviously, if you're ill and you have a cold, especially nowadays with COVID-19, I'm going to bring up that little snag again, start a whole other conversation. But especially with COVID-19, you got to be careful. And in fact, you should be going into the field without having some kind of a safety. They should be asking you those questions just to make sure. There still should be asking those questions when you're going into the field, whether or not you have any symptoms, right? Because we're still in the middle of this. But do be conscious of the fact that when you are calling in sick, it's not like, okay, I have a day, my kid wants to go to Disneyland and play a hooky day, right? And so I'm just going to call in sick because I'm allowed to call in sick. It really needs to be legitimate, because think about what you're doing to everybody else. I know that, depending on, let's say you're doing subsurface testing, right? You have teams. You have one person that calls out sick and it's not legitimate. It impacts the rest of the team. And so, just be very responsible when it comes to sick leave, because you really are putting other people out in a bind, if you're doing it and it's not legitimate. So obviously if it is legitimate, it's legitimate, but just being aware that sick time is not vacation. It's not something, I think sometimes when people think, oh, I have sick time, I better use all my sick time before the year's out. No, that's not how it works. It's not how it works. You legitimately should be sick when you take sick time.
Yeah. Well, that is a tough conversation, though. I'll tell you what, because especially when you're talking about salaried employees, people that even aren't salaried but work permanently for the company, that's definitely a valid thought, right? These people have a job, they're like that, but I've just seen so many times, and I'd probably say I have been there, especially early on in my career, where you learn really quickly that you don't have a lot of security, you don't have a lot of benefits, and you take what you can get. And sometimes being sick is kind of a vacation, especially if they're paying you for it.
I get it. But I have to say that I'm not going to ask. As an employer, when somebody tells me they're sick, I trust that they're sick. And actually, employers need to be really careful about questioning that, right? I trust that. But I'm just saying, from a professional sense, just remember, it's not like you're working at, you have let's say you're in the field. Let's say, what if is a desk job? There's a little bit less of a impact, right? If it's just a desk job and you take some time off. But when you're in the field, people are counting on you. Just, be responsible with it is all I'm saying. The one thing I thought would be good for us to cover as far as, this COVID-19 thing when it comes to what is HR allowed to ask. That's one thing that people are really questioning, is that they say that this is like a HIPAA violation, right? For the vaccination cards. So, you'll see my company has disclaimers up the Yahoo. I mean, they have, every time they ask, all we want is the vaccination card. Do not ask us for, or don't tell us why or why not. If you don't have a vaccination card, we do not want to know why, unless you're asking for an exemption. Do not tell us anything about your family or your personal medical history. We don't want, and so, just be conscious that if your company is asking for your vaccination card, they have no right to ask you for anything other than just that vaccination card, period. And right now, geez, when things could change just from now when we're recording until when this actually goes out in the podcast world.
Sure.
So when you're giving your vaccination card, just give they don't have to, there are going to be some, depending on where you're working, some states aren't even going to ask you for it. If you're working in California, if it gets to that point and the company's asking for the vaccination card, just know that's all you need to share. And that's all you should share is just the card. That's it. No reason why not, or any other kind of family history.
Right. Well, in the last few minutes here, going off some of the notes that Doug wrote, it's interesting because he put in for segment 3, he said, tips and tricks for dealing with colds and flus. What medicine do you take? Things like that. I don't know if we should give medical advice on what medicine to take. I will say, if you're not aware of this, let's say you're oh my God. I had a time when actually my wife and I she's an archaeologist as well. We were both monitoring in separate areas on a really big mining property in Nevada. We weren't together. We were spread out. We were in different areas. We each had a truck. And I think the night before we went out on one of the days, we were on 10-day sessions. We went to dinner with another crew from that same company that happened to be nearby, and we all met in town and we had dinner. And I totally got some of the worst food poisoning I've ever had in my life. And it was a really hot day out. Luckily, I had a really light day from a monitoring standpoint. A lot of times we just had to sit and wait in the truck until they knocked on the window and said, okay, we're doing something now. Because there was a lot of setup and a lot of things that these guys had to do. It was an interesting monitoring situation. And I was able to essentially sleep in the truck because I really couldn't leave. There was nobody to take my place. There was no possibility of that. So in that circumstance, you're just kind of screwed and you got to hope for the best. I've worked with food poisoning before too in New Mexico, and it just simply, wasn't fun. But as a pilot, we're taught that if you do need to get out there and do something, and again, I'm not providing medical advice, but Sudafed is typically non-drowsy, right? So if you're going to take something, take Sudafed because it will allow you to keep your senses about you and keep doing stuff and hopefully, fight your sickness. But obviously, I think COVID taught us all one thing, that, hey, if you actually wash your hands and try not to touch people, you'll get less sick. How many people have been sick in this last year, right? Just from the flu? Not that many.
No. Yeah, nothing.
I think sharing equipment, sharing water. I mean, I know people that were sharing Camelbacks all the time.
Oh, that's gross.
That was a common thing, right? It is gross. It is gross. But for some reason, I don't know, it's the grungier, the better. Yeah. In the field for some reason.
It's even gross for me to use my own Camelback.
Yeah, I hate Camel. I don't like Camelbacks for that reason, but yeah.
I can lean over and suck on my wife's hose for a little while. It's just not going to happen.
Not even your wife. Wow.
No.
So I think, COVID is actually really we were, I think, probably one of the first companies, if not that came out with this really very well thought out COVID regimen. I know that we had and safety plan and everything, and you and I had talked about it. We had talked about it on the podcast right after COVID started, right? And because we were out. In fact, we haven't stopped since COVID started, and our work, like many others, has just exponentially grown. So but I think we've actually been looking at our safety approach when it came to COVID, and what are we going to keep and not keep? And there's a decent amount that we think is useful that we're going to continue with. And I think overall, it's definitely going to, at least help when it comes to transmitting just the regular flu, cold, whatever, in the field, because we're all working, pretty in close quarters with each other, and you can't avoid it.
Yeah. I've also found it as a fringe benefit. It's mask wearing ain't so bad when you're at a really dusty site.
Right.
Lots of people were wearing masks even before then. That's why the mask thing wasn't even that big of a deal for so many people in the field, because especially if you're screening, I mean, a lot of people were wearing the gaiters anyway, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's just a good idea with silicosis and other things that you could possibly get from that fine dust, depending where you're at. And what's that Central California disease called that comes from mice or something like that, or something valley fever.
Valley fever.
Yeah. So we're no strangers to, looking out for stuff like that. So also in the line of, and this would be my last word on this is, when you're talking about sharing stuff, I mean, this is coming from a field of people who will lick something to see if it's bone or ceramic. So, our boundaries are somewhere else. They're not where normal people's boundaries are. But.
One little tip I just thought about before we end is that a lot of companies have trainings. Some they require from you, some they do not. So when you're talking to HR or you're talking to your crew, ask them if they have trainings that you can take. You get paid to do those trainings, and they're really helpful. You'd be surprised. Sometimes it seems like, it's like one of those things that HR creates so they can, minimize their liability or whatever. No, there really are. There's a lot of thought put into it. There's people that make a living as safety directors, and it's worth. It can't hurt, and you get paid to do it. So.
Yeah, for sure.
And it shows you're serious. It's another one of those things where it shows you're serious. It's very cool to do that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah, indeed. So, all right. Well, thanks, guys. This has been a really good discussion. Thanks, Bill, who was in for segment 1. We've got a large breadth of experience here and opinions. So I hope the audience learned something from that. So, all right. Well, we will be back next time. If you're in the United States, I hope you had a good Thanksgiving and you've got a good off season coming up. And we will see you in 2 weeks. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at ArchPodNet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks, everyone, for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for listening.
See you guys next time.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.